Hi everyone. We are going to talk about Alexander Pope's poem, The Rape of the Lock, this week here. I should say from the outset that I love The Rape of the Lock. I think it is an amazing poem, and it's one of the things that got me interested in studying 18th century literature for my graduate studies. So I'm excited to share it with you today. Um, One of the things that I think will help us understand how the poem worked in the social contexts of 18th century England is to note that it's based on true events. The text that we're reading online doesn't have the dedicatory letter that was originally published in the when it was published in the second edition in 1714, but I will post that so you can take a look at it if you want to. But here's what's the social background to it. I told you already that Pope belonged to a Catholic family, and so many of the Catholic families in England, since they were excluded from high society, had their own society and hung out together and knew each other and were in the same social circles. And one of those families had a daughter named Arabella Farmer, and she went to a party one day, and a young nobleman called Lord Peter cut off a lock of her hair, and it caused great conflict between the families, of course. A mutual friend of Pope's and of these families named John Carroll asked Pope to write a comic treatment of this as a way of kind of calming everybody down. He was hoping that this would smooth over all the ruffled feathers and everybody could get back to normal. So he did. He wrote The Rape of the Lock. And he claims to have written it very quickly, that he had this idea and wrote it down, and there it was. So the original version was written in only two cantos. And initially, since it was written more for this private circle kind of thing, it was circulated just among the friends. But then Pope did get permission from Arabella Farmer to publish it. And when he did, it became very popular. Lots of people read it, but it also became somewhat scandalous. People talked about it as if it had talked about sex too much and talked about conflict too much, and started connecting those things, since these were all Catholic families, connecting the kind of scandal that they saw in the poem with Catholicism, and it turned into kind of a big thing. So then the family got really upset. So then he wrote this dedicatory letter to Arabella Farmer, assuring her that it was not based on her at all, except for the fact that Belinda is beautiful and she is beautiful, and that he didn't mean any problems. One way that I think the letter is interesting, though, is in the way that he talks about Arabella Farmer as being gentle and, of course, you could never mean this, and sensitive. And there's a way of talking about women that the phrase gets used in scholarship for 18th century literature. It's called fair sexing women. And we see this a lot in literature, that we talk about, not we, authors will talk about women as being the fairer sex, and because of that, they have a different way of understanding things and a different intellectual ability and that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in that topic, go back and look at that. I think it's the last paragraph of the dedicatory letter that kind of pulls some of this out. But that's kind of a side note. It does give the background, though. So anyway, this became kind of controversial. People were talking about it. People were writing parodies of it. There was one called The Rape of the Smock. There were other things that people were talking. So Pope wrote later a satirical response to these criticisms called The Key to the Lock. And in it, he adopts the persona of somebody who is paranoid and trying to read everything into everything, and trying to satirize the conversation that's going on. And I think this is a good example of how Pope uses satire throughout his career. An essay on criticism that we read last week stays fairly even-handed. Addison criticized Pope for being too critical in it in some points, but essentially it doesn't really make fun of people or anything like that. However, there is a part of Pope's satire that does do that, and his most famous example of that would be the Dunciad, which was written towards the later part of his career, where he adopts the persona of somebody called Martinus or Martinus Scriblerus, and writes in his voice a mock epic poem in which they praise the god dullness. So he goes through then and talks about all of the critics who he thinks are not doing a good job, all of the writers who he considers hacks, and talks about how they write in praise of dullness. So you can kind of get a sense for where that is there. It's an excellent poem. It's considered one of Pope's best works. So if you have time and inclination, you can go back and read that. So anyway, the themes that I want to talk about in The Rape of the Lock. First of all, obviously, he's using the form of a mock epic. I think you can see a lot of how that gets played out, that we see the card game, for example, is like an epic battle. We have the sylphs and the gnomes. Ariel and Umbriel are the otherworldly, the angels, the gods. The Cave of Spleen is the underworld, the otherworldliness. So we see that these kind of mystical creatures, what Pope calls the machinery, working in the background while the people are doing things. So I think it's interesting that if we take it as a story, what we basically have, the plot of the story is that a young woman is getting ready to go to a party. She goes to a party. The man who kind of likes her gets offended by her, cuts off a piece of her hair. Her friend gets mad. They all start yelling at each other. Somebody stabs somebody with a hairpin. The hair gets lost, and that's it. And it's not a great story. Those of you who teach high school, you could probably hear conflicts like this going on 100 times a day. If somebody's friend gets offended and then the friend asks the boyfriend to intervene, and it's a pretty basic story from that end. But when elevating it to the epic, or really using the mock epic, I think Pope allows us to see some of those greater issues. There's an essay by a critic named Cynthia Wall that I will give a reference to in the notes, the reading notes that I'm going to post. But she points out that in 1818, William Hazlitt commented about the rape, and I'm quoting here, "It is like looking through a microscope where everything assumes a new character and a new consequence, where things are seen in their minutest circumstances and slightest shades of difference, where the little becomes gigantic, the deformed beautiful, and the beautiful deformed." And so I like that image of looking at it through a microscope, because it's not that it takes something frivolous and shows that it's frivolous by making it epic in proportion. It's that by making something epic, we can see how something that is frivolous actually might seem more important, or might be more important than it initially seems. And that's the perspective that I take on the Rape of the Lock. Now, obviously, there's some sexual connotation there, that the lock is symbolic of chastity and of a sexual conquest in the way that the Baron cuts off Belinda's hair and then brags about it and all of that kind of stuff. But my take on the Rape of the Lock is that the reaction that Belinda and Thalestris have is relevant to the way that women achieved power in the 18th century through using their beauty, through using some kind of flirtatious behavior. So I kind of see it as being more than just a frivolous response to something that's insignificant. I think that the act of cutting off Belinda's hair is quite significant for the way that she is able to negotiate these power relationships. And I think that by looking at it through the epic lens, we're able to see that a little bit more clearly. So let's see, what else do I want to talk about? I should note that I am interested in the gender aspect, the new historicist aspect of this poem, but another way that people often approach the poem is through a Marxist perspective, because you can see that there's quite an emphasis on things and how the presence of things in life, the application of things, the way Belinda gets herself ready to go out, even the things that are on the Baron's table before he goes out, they have a sense of sort of commodifying the relationships and the personalities that are in the poem. So if anybody's interested in pursuing that angle, I have an article I can send you, and there are many more out there. But you should know that Marxism, in addition to gender criticism and, well, really more feminist from my perspective, but also new historicist, there are lots of different ways of approaching this poem. So there's a lot to go on with here in case you're interested in some other aspect. A couple more things I want to talk about before the video cuts me off is I will post the rules of the game of Amber that they play. It's a card game. It's very complicated. I don't truly understand all the rules myself, but it involves trumps and sort of kind of like hearts or euchre or something like that, where there's a lot of back and forth and different cards have the power. So reading that back and forth, notice the language that Pope uses and how it is very similar to the kinds of epic battles that some of you, if you have read, will have seen in the Iliad, the Aeneid, but also certainly that all of us saw in Paradise Lost, and the kinds of conversations between the warring forces. The other thing I want to note is that the Cave of Spleen is what is being represented as the underworld. And so obviously in this mock epic sense, we have a contrast between things that are happening in real life and then also what's going on behind the scenes in the otherworldly part of it. And so spleen in the 18th century was understood not only as a bodily organ, but also as the name for all of these associated ills, usually emotional ills like depression, anxiety, things like that. It's also associated with women of fertile age, and it's associated with the word hysteria, which comes from the Latin for the word for uterus. And so the kinds of ailments that are going to come with spleen are associated with women and with being irrational and unable to control their emotions and things like that. The other thing is that Clarissa's moral that we read in Canto 5 was added by Pope in 1717 in the third edition, I believe, and it was added, he says, in order to provide and to explain the moral of the poem. I think there's some ambiguity in how we can understand that, though, because we can question the extent to which Clarissa is telling Belinda, calm down, there's nothing you can do about it, you're just a woman, that kind of thing. Or is she criticizing that this is the state that women have, and here's how you need to leverage the power that you have in order to use it in the right way? It gets complicated by the fact that Clarissa is the person who handed the scissors to the Baron so that he could actually cut off the hair. But there are different ways of reading that, so consider that as you're reading and as you're rethinking about the poem, what those kinds of things say about how we understand the poem. There's a lot more that I could say, but I think that this is already getting too long and I don't want to tax your patience, so I'll save it for the discussion boards. But I hope you enjoy reading the poem. If you have any problems with it, let me know. I know that there are some points that because Pope uses this elevated language, which, by the way, is in contrast to the plain language that he uses in an essay on criticism. So he's very clearly changing the rhetoric that he's using to match the mode that he's trying to use as well. If you have any problems with understanding it or anything like that, let me know. I will enjoy discussing this with you, I am sure, and I hope that you are having a good week.